What's up, guys? This is just going to be a video where I give my final thoughts on J. Cole, what happened in 2024, and the big three, all that kind of stuff before he releases the Fall Off on February 6th. I wanted to make this video because I'll be doing a reaction to J. Cole's long anticipated album, The Fall Off, which, like I said, comes out on February 6th. And my plan is really just to enjoy the project for what it is and to not talk about the beef, not talk about the big three, not talk about 7 Minute Drill, all that kind of stuff. But I do think all of that is pretty important and necessary to talk about in order to understand this moment in J. Cole's career and how the fall off could potentially affect his legacy. But hey, if J. Cole repeatedly brings up the fall off, I guess I'll have to talk about it during my reaction, but that'll really be on him. Like, my plan's not to talk about it. That's not what I really want to do. But I do want to start off by talking about what the big three was and why Kendrick, Drake, and J. Cole were the ones that were deemed as the members of the big three. More than anything, I'm speaking from my memory and from my experience as a longtime hip hop fan and as a longtime fan of all three of those artists that were once deemed members of the big three. So, I've been listening to hip hop for a long time. So there's a lot of this is just coming from my head. I didn't do a ton of research about it. But anyways, I think every so many years you had a new generation of prominent rappers that would come along, and like two to like five of them would end up being the real faces of each generation. Obviously, you had guys like Tupac and Biggie in the 90s. You could also throw someone like Nas in there as well if you wanted to like try to make a big three out of every decade or out of every generation. But it wasn't always three. You know what I'm saying? You had Jay-Z and Eminem. They were really big in the late 90s, early 2000s as well, with Eminem doing Marshall Mathers LP, Jay-Z on the Blueprint, Volume 1, all that kind of stuff. And then, you had guys like Kanye, Wayne, T.I., 50 Cent from the early 2000s. And those guys kind of went from the early 2000s all the way up to the very end of the 2000s. I think it's also important to mention that with these rappers I'm talking about, they weren't only critically successful, but they were also like pretty skilled lyrically to varying degrees. And having that balance, I think, is what put them in that conversation to where they're considered one of the best of their generation. Obviously, you got to have, I feel like it's the balance, really. There were artists that were extremely commercially successful with, in some cases having multiple hit songs. Take a rapper like Flo Rida, for example. And no disrespect to Flo Rida, but he wasn't getting that respect from the hip hop heads because he didn't have that balance where he was putting out quality work lyrically. He just had really, really big songs, Get Low, Whistle. There's even more. There's a ton of them. There's also, and I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen a new big three or any form of like a passing of the torch from Cole and Drake to a new generation of artists, because I don't think there's a lot of balance right now between commercial success and lyrical ability that we're seeing that's popular right now. And the ones that have shown the potential for that haven't really stuck around like we maybe would have initially thought that they were going to, in terms of being, at the top of the game with the crown. You do have rappers that are extremely lyrical but don't have a ton of commercial success, such as Jid or Denzel Curry. That's not to say that these guys don't have a few hits here or there, but their albums aren't necessarily moving the 200K plus units that a prominent artist is expected to move in order to be considered, really commercially successful, like at the top level. There's also artists that have had some commercial success, but don't exactly have the lyrical substance to be in, you know, what we would call the big three. You have guys like Lil Uzi Vert and Playboy Cardi, guys that make slaps, guys that make fun songs, have hit songs, popular albums, but they just don't have that lyrical content to really put themselves up and say like, oh, that's one of the best rappers. I think the only rapper that's really gotten close to achieving this balance is Tyler the Creator. And in reality, he's really just part of the same generation as Drake and Cole. He just didn't start putting an emphasis on lyrics until that big three between J. Cole, Drake, and Kendrick had already been established. I think Baby Keem might be the rapper that's best primed to achieve that balance and become, you know, the one that's wearing the crown in hip hop. But until he or somebody else actually, you know, accomplishes that feat, I don't think we're going to be seeing a changing of the guards as far as who the top rappers are for a while, which is strange because we've never really seen it take this long for things to move on to a new generation. Like normally, you know, it like all those other ones, you know, it took like maybe 5 to 7 years. But it's been like a really long time. It's been something like 12, 13 years. I think you could also chalk this up to the rise of streaming services and the lack of lyrical rap really being prominent in the mainstream at this moment. There's not a ton of lyrical rappers outside of these three guys that are really just making noise like that, unfortunately. And Tyler, obviously. And I mean, you had Clips, you have a few other examples, but it's not happening a ton. Anyways, I say all of that to say that the balance of commercial success and lyrical ability is what made Kendrick, Drake, and J. Cole the quote unquote big three of their generation. And these guys came up in a generation that was much more lyrical. They had artists like Joey Badass. They had artists like Wale, Mac Miller, Tyler, as I mentioned, Earl Sweatshirt. You had Logic when he was going through with all his mixtapes. And they had a bunch of other artists that were the peers of their generation that were a lot more lyrical and kind of striving for what, you know, those three eventually accomplished. I think what made these three artists rise above the rest of these people is that they were connected to really prominent people during their rise to fame. Drake, obviously, as we know, was signed to Young Money at the height of Lil Wayne's fame and popularity. When I was in middle school, everybody loved and listened to Lil Wayne, and pretty much no other rapper was even really in the discussion as far as being the best. So with Drake set to be his successor, Drake was primed to have a big career. Basically, from the moment his career started, he was set to become a big artist, in my opinion. J. Cole had a similar situation, but maybe different circumstances. He was signed to Jay-Z, and this was Jay-Z, you know, still being pretty successful. He was having great commercial success with songs like Empire State of Mind, which I think at the time, and maybe still is, you know, one of his biggest songs. And he was doing Watch the Throne with Kanye. So with him up there and him being as successful as he is, also producing people like Kanye and Rihanna, J. Cole was set up for success as well. Then there was Kendrick. Obviously, he's better known to having his association with Top Dog Entertainment. But when he first came to prominence, I feel like a big factor in that was the fact that he had been working with Dr. Dre and kind of had a joint venture going on with TDE and Aftermath, setting Kendrick, you know, to follow the footsteps of people like Eminem and 50 Cent and becoming, you know, a star under the tutelage of Dr. Dre. In retrospect, I don't really think Dr. Dre was as involved as we initially thought. But if you remember back to the early days of Kendrick's career, he was being heavily marketed as basically another Dr. Dre protege. He had that Beats commercial, different things like that. He was really just initially was kind of seen as a Dr. Dre, another Aftermath artist. Obviously, we found out it was like more Top Dog, and that wasn't the case. But that's how he's marketed at first. Drake, he blasted onto the charts quickly with Best I Ever Had. And then he went on to have a few more hits, Find Your Love, etc. And then obviously he made the critically acclaimed album Take Care, which was mostly an R&B album, but still, in my opinion, a great album nonetheless. And it also featured a Kendrick Lamar song as an interlude on that album. J. Cole's Sideline Story did okay with commercial songs. Like, it had Workout, it had I Just Can't Get Enough, and in my opinion, it had some like lyrical highlights on the album, such as the song Lost One. But it wasn't quite enough to fully make him look like somebody that was going to be ready for the throne anytime soon after that. Things looked at that point, honestly, pretty primed for Drake to have the crown all to himself until Kendrick dropped Good Kid, Mad City, which not only saw commercial success but also saw critical acclaim. It really had that balance, and it was pretty much deemed as an instant classic. And still, though, even with that, it looked like Drake was at the top of the mountain. And he even had, I believe, if my memory serves me right, he had Kendrick and Rocky opening up for him on one of his tours. So, from that perspective, it felt like Drake was still kind of top dog in that situation, no pun intended. And then obviously, J. Cole, he went on to release Born Center in 2013, which again, that brought him some more commercial success. He had songs like Power Trip, and I thought he had really good lyrical songs, such as the song Let Nas Down, which Nas even made a response song to. And I think that album, while it didn't push him over the top, it was doing a good job of keeping J. Cole in that conversation. In retrospect, I don't really love Born Center. I don't even think it was like top two albums that came out on the day it came out. If I remember correctly, Yeezus came out that day, and Mac Miller's Watching Movies with the Sound Off came out that same day as well. And I personally enjoyed both of those albums more so than I did Born Center. But still, Born Center kept J. Cole in the conversation. But everything really changed when Kendrick released the infamous Control verse, where he named several rappers by their names in an attempt to create a competitive environment in hip hop. Drake was upset with this verse. I think even J. Cole might have been a little upset to a certain extent, but I do think it lit a fire under both of them, because like J. Cole's next album was 2014 Forest Hills Drive. And shortly after that, Drake released If You're Reading This, It's Too Late. Obviously, like, Nothing Was the Same was the first album that came out directly after that, but that album was mostly complete with the exception of a couple of songs. So If You're Reading This Too Late was like really the one that came out, after that. Like, he made it after that. And in my opinion, that might have been like his best like display from a hip hop perspective. And when Kendrick proved that he wasn't a one album wonder with To Pimp a Butterfly, I feel like with J. Cole doing 2014 Forest Hills Drive and all the things Drake had done, and with Kendrick having those two albums, it kind of solidified them at the top, showing that all three of them could show that they had lyrical skill, they could make quality albums, and they were all commercially viable. I don't need to go into as much detail as far as what happened after that. J. Cole, obviously, he released For Your Eyes Only, and then he released KOD in 2018, which is the album where the fall off was first announced. And after that, he went kind of quiet from a solo perspective. He dropped Middle Child, and then he focused on a lot of Dreamville collabs, which I think helped make artists like Jid a little bit more popular. And then Kendrick, he released Damn in 2017, which was, I think still to this day the most commercially successful album that he had made. And then he worked on the Black Panther soundtrack in 2018, but he also went quiet for quite a bit after that as well from a solo perspective. So with Kendrick and J. Cole going quiet on the solo front for at least a handful of years, this pretty much gave Drake all the attention to himself, and that allowed him to be really successful commercially. He dropped Scorpion, he featured on Sicko Mode, he had several hits along the way, and then he even continued to have more commercial success with Certified Lover Boy in 2021. And then, J. Cole, he finally came back in 2021 with the off season, a project that I felt like showed that he was still hungry and he was still one of the best rappers we had in the game. It felt like, at least in my opinion, he was trying maybe a little bit too hard to be conceptual with the albums For Your Eyes Only and KOD. Although like the outro title track to For Your Eyes Only is amazing, maybe even his best song, but overall with those two albums, his music wasn't hitting the same to me as it was on 2014 Forest Hills Drive. But the off season actually had me feeling really good about what J. Cole had in the future, and really the off season was marketed as a basically an appetizer to the fall off. And then with Kendrick, he showed up in 2021. He featured on Baby Keem's Family Ties and a few other songs off of Baby Keem's album. And on Family Ties, he stated he's going to be smoking on top fives, which it actually ended up throwing me for a loop later when Kendrick resurfaced in 2022 with Mr. Morale, because that was more of like an introspective album where he's talking about breaking cycles, talking about generational trauma, and talking about taking responsibility for actions that you've done that have hurt people. After that album, it made me leave it thinking, Kendrick wasn't really in a competitive mindset anymore. But, a little bit later, we started to see things start to bubble up to the surface between Kendrick and Drake. They had spent, several number of years after the Control verse swapping subliminals back and forth, which is a video topic of its own. I'm not going to spend really any time talking about it. And honestly, there's tons of people who have already made videos about it. I'm not really going to. I think we have a video on it, somewhere on our channel. But anyways, when Drake dropped Honestly Nevermind, he dropped that on Kendrick's birthday. So that was like the first kind of thing that was like making things bubble to the surface, even more so than they already had been. And then in 2023, Baby Keem and Kendrick dropped The Hillbillies. And in that song, it kind of sounds like they're mocking Drake's flow on his song Sticky. And then Kendrick did a feature on Beyonce's Is It America Has a Problem, where he's sending a lot of shots that, sound like they're towards Drake. And definitely in retrospect, I think they were towards Drake, in my opinion. I think the story of the big three really ends with the song First Person Shooter. I think, as we all know, Kendrick was invited to be a guest feature on that song, but ultimately decided to decline that invitation. And honestly, this is just my theory about it. But what I think happened is Drake invited Kendrick and J. Cole to be on the song. And I think a big reason for that was he was like, if I get all three of us on a song, it's going to be a huge song. It's going to be a ginormous song, which absolutely would have been the case. And then I also think it would have helped Drake in the sense that he wouldn't have really had to compete with them anymore. Like they would all be kumbaya, collaborative, and he wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. And I also think he could, like, if he wanted to, and I feel like he let J. Cole outshine him. And not that J. Cole, can't outshine him, but I feel like he definitely didn't put any effort in really competing with J. Cole. I think he would have done the same to Kendrick, and he would have let them shine lyrically. That way he could be like, oh, I'm the guy that gave them this number one, though. I think when J. Cole wrote his verse, he thought that Kendrick was going to be on that song. But I think what happened was Drake found out that Kendrick declined the request, and then he decided he was going to diss Kendrick on the second half of that song, and J. Cole basically ended up being guilty by association from Kendrick's perspective. I mean, I do think there is a possibility that Kendrick was just simply offended at the idea of a big three and having to share the crown. I mean, that's totally a possibility as well. But I think a lot of things that Drake was saying at the end of First Person Shooter were directed at Kendrick. I'll use Grammy as a doorstop. If your pub was up for sale, I'd sell the whole thing. I can't remember what he said, but you know what I mean. I think that was directed at Kendrick. Anyways, we kind of all know what happened after First Person Shooter. Kendrick disses them both. On Like That, J. Cole responds with 7-Minute Drill and then apologizes. And then later that year, he apologizes in my opinion, to Drake with the song Port Antonio, which is a good song, but kind of like he's fence sitting a little bit on that song. And not that he had to take a side, but it was a, I don't know, I just felt like he didn't need to make that song. Now, as far as what my opinion is, as far as the situation in regards to J. Cole, I think J. Cole should have never dissed if he was going to apologize. He had spent years basically saying he's going to destroy any rapper. And then when he finally got his chance to engage in a battle with a rapper, he backed off. And I didn't like that at all. It was just, I don't know, it just didn't sit right with me. Now, as far as my final thoughts on the big three, I don't think there is one. I think Kendrick is the best of his generation and of those three artists. One, I think Kendrick's discography is greatly better than both of theirs. And I think he's also the best balance. Like Drake, especially more so recently, like Drake has leaned like all the way to the commercial side. And recently, like J. Cole's leaned all the way over to the lyrical side. And I feel like Kendrick could do both of those things. And at times, I think he could do both of those things better than both Drake and J. Cole. I mean, when Kendrick wanted to, he made he had like 3 or 4 number one hits over the past year or two. And yeah, I just feel like Kendrick's proved himself time and time again. But I mean, anyway, this is about more like J. Cole. I mean, if I'm ranking between J. Cole and Drake, I would probably have J. Cole ahead of Drake. For one, simply like J. Cole has never used ghostwriters, and for me, that's kind of an automatic disqualifier for me. And I also think because after 2018, like when J. Cole and Kendrick were kind of out of the way, that's when I feel like Drake started shifting to a more lazy approach with his music. And I don't think he's made anything that's been like truly great, or even like good since Scorpion. I mean, except for Her Loss with 21 Savage was good, but like Certified Lover Boy, Honestly Nevermind, some Sexy Songs, I have not enjoyed really anything from him in a while. And I used to love his projects, especially like Take Care, Nothing Was the Same, all of that. There was a time where I thought Drake was at the top of like maybe even both of them. Probably that was after he released Back to Back, and if you're reading this, it's too late, but I can't really put him higher than either one of them at this moment. But anyways, let's talk about the fall off. Since I'm going to be reacting to it. J. Cole first announced it at the end of KOD on the song 1985, which in parentheses said an intro to the fall off. Doubt it's going to be the intro to the fall off, but who knows. And he kept hyping it up, with the off season. He was describing the fall offs concept when he was rolling out the off season. He was talking about how it's about him trying to rap at the best level he could possibly be at, and then choosing that to be the point where he retires. He was, stating that he was treating rap like a sport. He was forcing himself to write verses in 7 minutes, which is actually, where the song 7 Minute Drill got its name. And, the fall off initially, like, it was, pretty well understood that it was going to release in 2024. And it seems like the Like That verse came at its worst time, because I believe Might Delete Later and the Dreamville Fest and everything was meant to serve as a, kind of the start of the rollout for the fall off. But unfortunately, with the cloud over his head, which was Like That, and the response and is he going to respond or not, I think he just kind of felt pressured to respond to Kendrick, especially after years and years of him saying he's the best, he's at the top level. And he apologized. He felt like he didn't really have any real beef with Kendrick. And as much as I think that maybe that kind of takes away from him in terms of his ranking, I do respect that he was honest about it and just admitted, like, okay, I was kind of tripping a little bit. He recently did the Birthday Blizzard kind of mixtape, which I reacted to. And he, on that album, on that mixtape, he was basically saying he paused everything to started over after the apology. The fall off pretty much had really extremely high expectations before any of this stuff happened, and now I feel like they're even higher, since it's been even longer that we've had to wait for it. And some of his best work was supposedly on the original version of the fall off, and I'm still expecting a lot of those songs to have made the cut, especially with this being a double disc. So I'm pretty excited to see how it turns out. I would really prefer that J. Cole doesn't touch on any of the stuff I've talked about in this video, because he brought it up on Port Antonio and he brought it up on Birthday Blizzard. And I'm also kind of hoping this album isn't just him just rapping his ass off the entire time. I'm, you know, just trying to go crazy. I'm hoping he's also like, I hope he's bringing the balance to the album that got him up to this point. With songs like I want him to have songs like Middle Child that kind of slap and could be hits. But I also want, some storytelling songs like the title track to For Your Eyes Only, for example. Or maybe like an introspective or reflective track like Wet Dreams or '03 Adolescence. I'm hoping for him to kind of just take everything that he's done and give us something that is new and something that is fresh. And I'm curious to see where this album will rank in his discography, where this will put him, if this truly is his last album, where does he sit amongst all time rappers and where does he sit on that list? For me, he's he's probably a top 20 rapper of all time, maybe. And I just haven't been able to put him in like that top 10, top 5. But if this is a double disc of straight heat, I mean, I do think he has a classic with 2014 Forest Hills Drive. Um, he has a pretty good album with the off season. He has a classic mixtape with Friday Night Lights, which I forgot to mention. Um, For Your Eyes Only, I think the title track's one of the better hip hop songs ever made. And I think he has a chance to put himself very high up there and have an argument. Unfortunately, do I think he'll be able to crack the top 5 of anybody's list? Probably not if this is his last album, except for like the hardcore J. Cole stands. But anyways, let me know what y'all think, what your opinion is on this project. What do you want to hear from it? What did you think of Birthday Blizzard? And I will see y'all for the fall off and a few other reactions this week as well. More Tame Impala coming up as well. So thank you guys for watching.